Welcome, everybody, to another in our now increasingly occasional series of firesides surrounding the Howard W. Hunter Chair in Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University. My name is Matthew Bowman. I am the Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies here at CGU. And if you would like notifications of our future events, you will see in the chat a link to the events website. There is on that page a whole list of our past events, including actually one that Olsen Tait joined us on several years ago, and an area where you can sign up for email notifications. You will also see there a link to donate if you would be interested in helping to support us as we work to promote greater thought and consideration and contemplation of the Latter-day Saint tradition. We will start tonight with an opening prayer, following which I will welcome our two panelists and introduce them and say a bit about what we will be hearing tonight. So I have invited our prayers to join us. Excellent. Our opening prayer tonight, actually both prayers will be given by David and Sunitha Gill, who are, as it happens, aunt and uncle to James Goldberg, who is delighted at their presence. James, did you know that they were going to pray? Well, he is happy to see them. James, so they claim, is their favorite oldest nephew and past babysitter of their children. Sunitha is a physician at a community clinic here in Los Angeles. David works in public accounting. Their families were actually pioneers of the church in India. Their founding fathers and mothers there. And we're grateful to have them with us tonight. So we'll invite David to give our opening prayer.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we are grateful to Thee for the many blessings that we have. We're especially grateful to be gathered together tonight, to be able to listen to important and uplifting stories of the history of the church, especially as it relates to young women. We're grateful for this wonderful program of young women and how much strength and inspiration is given to so many for so many years. We're grateful for our two presenters tonight and Brother Bowman for all his efforts in organizing these events. Bless us all that we might learn and have a better insight to this important history that we have and this legacy that we have of the Young Women's Organization. And these things we pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Our speakers tonight are James Goldberg and Lisa Olsen Tait. And I will introduce them in a moment, but first a couple of items of business here. You will note that the chat box is disabled. You will not be able to chat tonight, but if you have questions, and I hope you do, you can submit questions using the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen. If you scroll over the bottom of the screen, you will see a little bar pop up. There's a Q&A there. Please enter your questions there, and we will get to them toward the end of this event. This event is also being recorded, as you may have noticed. It will be available on the same website that I have linked to in the chat. You'll find it there probably toward the end of next week. And now let me introduce our presenters. We have with us tonight, as I say, Lisa Olsen Tait and James Goldberg. They are two of the authors of this volume, Carry On, which is a new history of the Young Women's Organization in the church. Lisa Olsen Tait is the managing historian for women's history in the church history department. She is the author of a number of interesting works with particular interest in the study of Susie Young Gates, a daughter of Brigham Young and one of the leaders in the church in the late 19th, early 20th century. James Goldberg is also a historian in the church history department. He is, as I say, a co-author of Carry On and also author of a good deal of wonderful fiction and nonfiction exploring the Latter-day Saint experience. My wife and I, a year or so ago, read the five books of Jesus together for our Easter celebrations, and it was very meaningful to us. So I encourage you to check out the other works of these authors as well as the one they'll be discussing tonight. So they are going to present to us for the next 20, 30 minutes or so. When they are done, the three of us on your screens will have a conversation about this book. And following that, we will throw it open to your questions. So with that, I am going to give it to you, Lisa and James.
So let's see. Is anybody, are we seeing my screen now? Let's see. There's our title slide. Okay. Well, thank you. We are really happy to be here and loved every chance we get to talk about this book, which has been a labor of love for all of us that have been involved in it. Just by way of, let's see, let me put it in presentation mode just for kicks. There we go. Okay, so by way of background, Carry On, the Latter-day Saint Young Women Organization, 1870 to 2024, officially was published last week, March 3rd. This is the first comprehensive academic history of the Young Women Organization, and it is written as a narrative history. That was a decision that we made early on. As you may be aware, much of the work that we've done at the Church History Department has been in the vein of documentary editing. But we wanted to tell this story by building an analytical frame that would weave together what we call the institutional story and the cultural story. So what happens in the organization and how that is reflecting and responding to cultural currents over time, including in the church as well as in the culture at large. We have four co-authors on the book: myself, our dear loved colleague Kate Holbrook, Amber Taylor, and James Goldberg. And it's published by the Church Historians Press. And I have a QR code here on the slide that will point you to the Church Historians Press website. We are not publishing the full text of the book online yet, but the introduction is there and the images, as well as several appendices to the book. And one of those that you may find of interest is, I can't claim that it's comprehensive because there were so many of these over the years, but it's a very exhaustive list and gallery of the Young Women Awards and jewelry over time. We get calls at the Church History Department on a regular basis. Someone's cleaning out their mom's jewelry box, and what was this, and what did it stand for, and so forth. So we hope that this would be a reference source for people, as well as just being kind of fun if you went through the Young Women program to find your piece of jewelry and where it fits into the bigger picture. So that's kind of a little bit of background on the book, and we can talk more about that later. James, do you want to introduce us to the three parts of the book?
Yeah. So the Young Women's Organization has been around a long time under various different names through different periods. So we split the book into these three chronological periods. The first one, called the Youth of Zion, takes us from the founding of the organization in the home of Brigham Young, and as it spreads through territorial Utah after the railroad reaches Utah. And that part continues until the church centennial, when the saints really start to think about what is it going to mean to have these new generations who aren't connected to that same pioneer experience and are making different experiences of their own. So part two starts with that experience and with the composition of the hymn Carry On that gives the book its name. And then continues through what we might think of as the MIA period, where the Mutual Improvement Association is an important part of church life. Over the course of the 1970s, as we'll discuss, that changes. Part 3 starts with the Ardith Cap presidency and the Young Women Values, many of us know, and continues essentially to the present.
Okay, so we're going to give you the lightning round version of the book, chapter by chapter, just to kind of trace an overview of the story, of the history, of the trajectory. So let's see how quickly we can do this. So in chapter 1, we go from the Young Ladies Department of the Ladies Cooperative Retrenchment Association, which is what it's called in 1870, among these daughters of Brigham Young that you see here, to the Young Ladies Mutual Improvement Association, the YLMIA. In this period, the associations are local, they're quite autonomous. They're seen as kind of daughters of the Relief Society. The Relief Society is the umbrella for the women's sphere in the church. And so the Young Ladies, as that original name says, is kind of the Young Ladies department of the women's work in the church. The emphasis is on improvement in spiritual, social, cultural, and educational pursuits. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then in 1880, Elmina Shepherd Taylor, who you see here, is called as the first general president of the associations at the same time that President John Taylor establishes what they have originally called central boards or general presidencies for each of the women's organizations. In chapter 2, which takes us up around the turn of the 20th century, the Young Ladies Associations become the Young Ladies Mutual Improvement Association in the singular. It's a time of centralization and standardization, and that's represented by the publication of the Young Woman's Journal, and then in 1893 and 1896, the first 2 lesson guides, the first time they've given lessons to the associations to use. This is also a time of expanding horizons for girls and for young women. And we have here Maud May Babcock in her cutting edge gymnasium costume in 1894, demonstrating physical culture for us. And this is a time when the concept of adolescence is taking hold to describe new life patterns for young people. And the YLMIA goes through this period of expansion and centralization and standardization. And that's represented here by Sister Taylor, front and center, and her general board in 1898. In 1890, she called the first 4 aides to her board. And by 1898, you see how much that board has grown. And so there's this expanding role for a centralized organization in this period. In chapter 3, let's see if I can advance the slides. Yeah. Chapter 3, the Young Ladies and Young Men's Associations become simply the MIA as they begin to work closely to incorporate elements of the progressive recreation movement at a time that those who lived through it experienced as generational and cultural revolution. In 1922, the MIA is assigned by the first presidency to oversee recreation and leisure activities for the church. And for the YLMIA, this results in the establishment of camp and Beehive Girls and the Gleaners. In the MIA, generally, it leads to things like road shows and Golden Green Balls. And on the right, we see here the huge 50th anniversary Jubilee celebration that they have in 1925, and ever expanding contests and festivals at June Conference, which becomes a staple of the Mormon calendar during this period. And that emphasis on recreation, or what they call teaching the gospel through activities, or spiritualized recreation, is going to structure and be the central animating force in the organization for over 50 years. In chapter 4, The YLMIA becomes the YWMIA, Young Women's Organization. They thought that sounded more modern, I think. And leaders engage in a far-ranging discussion about the identity and scope of the organization, which is part of what we call in the book the modernity crisis in the MIA. So the optimism of the progressive era is giving way to more worrisome currents in the thick of the Great Depression and concerns about young people's confrontation with modern scientific and social trends. The Treasures of Truth Project, you see the book here, was introduced in 1930 for the church's centennial and encourages young women to look both to the past and to the future by collecting family history material and by collecting material about themselves. Meanwhile, with immigration to Zion no longer encouraged, the church has recognized the need to provide the full church program in the mission field. And so young women's programs, especially the Beehive Girls, proved to be highly adaptable and very popular in the missions. We have here a group of Beehive Girls from Germany, and that was one of the first places to have the materials translated and made available in the local languages. And then, of course, World War II provides a dramatic interruption to these trends. And there's a kind of a period where a lot of things are on hold, but that investment in the local leadership and local efforts pays off during the war. And then chapter 5 covers what we call the heyday of the MIA. In the post-war boom years, growth becomes the animating force. The MIA expands in numbers and scope and becomes really the flagship program for the church. Receives a lot of positive attention nationally. The massive dance, drama, music festivals held in conjunction with June Conference showcase Latter-day Saint youth as bright, wholesome, and accomplished. They are the fruits of the gospel. And this is what we have to offer the world is our youth. And they are the proof of the truth of the gospel. And that works both in an outward facing way as with the world as the audience, but also in an inward facing way to ourselves, to the Latter-day Saints as an affirmation of who we are. Now, in the 1950s, of course, especially after 1955, international growth in the church starts to pick up on like orders of magnitude. And so the MIA is an important locus for fellowshipping people in the mission field, but that also starts to lay bare some aspects of this massive, ambitious program that simply cannot be replicated or are not sustainable as the church grows.
Yeah, and just to pick up still chronologically in chapter 5, some of the examples we found of that, they've got this strong centralized program that's working very well some places, but in Australia, they're doing the elocution lessons. How do you pronounce things? As their MIA activities, and no one can understand why they're being asked to practice words which have non-standard pronunciations in Utah and the Mountain West. In Australia, they can't even imagine how to mispronounce these words. So there's some things that aren't translating. Since we're talking to Claremont, I want to give a shout out to California for helping the church adapt and innovate. In that period, they've had a large June conference where saints from around the church have gathered and performed, and a lot of California schools, their vacations are different and they can't come, so they start having a separate conference at the Hollywood Bowl in the 1950s as there's momentum on this. And that sort of culture leads into this next era when the church is continuing to use MIA nationally and internationally. They get very serious about MIA and the missions and trying to figure out what's going to work. We've got really interesting stories. The church is just getting established in the Philippines at this point. It's the pioneers of what is now 750,000 members in that country. And Nanita Reyes Capiz remembered that to her, MIA almost was church. Whole families would come, grandparents would come. She met her husband through MIA because he found out activities were happening and came along to play the guitar with caroling and then joined the church and they were able to be married. So MIA hugely influential in the 1960s and that period as the church is getting more established around the world. At the same time, though, um, the church's relationship to youth culture, instead of seeing it themselves now primarily as integrated and their youth as an example of how they've succeeded, they're starting to feel the tension as youth culture shifts. And so we get things like for the strength of youth that tries to define a sort of distinct Latter-day Saint identity that maybe has a little more separation from what's becoming the cultural norm. And then as we continue into the 1970s,
Just to
that,
add real quick, can I just add real quick?
yes,
The title of this chapter comes from Harold B. Lee's announcement in 1961 of the correlation movement. And so that's taking shape in the 1960s, mostly in the background. It's starting to kind of be felt in certain ways. The youth programs are carrying on, but he announces correlation and calls it a program of defense. And that is, so it's not just about organization, it's not just about simplification, it's about fortifying the church, fortifying the youth to withstand what they see as this rising tide of wickedness, like James was talking about.
yeah. And so then in this 1970s period, what happens is the spiritual defense that they were trying to organize initially informs their thinking about organizational reform and how can we more closely coordinate between church organizations? How can we refocus things on sort of core spiritual purposes? In the 1960s, you did have places like we looked at a Pittsburgh ward where half of the ward members were involved in MIA callings because you'd have the ward program, you'd have a stake organization, a regional organization. There's a lot of labor that went into this huge program that showcased youth. Um, so as they're trying to move things through lines of priesthood keys and simplify and maybe also make it more streamlined so that church programs will work in different places, there's a huge change organizationally from where they had been. Um, and at this point, the MIA, as people had known it, where there was a full line of reporting between a central organization, regional, stake, and ward and branch levels, those lines are cut. At the same time that they're trying to think through what's the new nature of the program. And so we see them go through lots of things. We've included this image of a short-lived program called Behold Thy Handmaiden that the young women leadership had put together and advanced as sort of a curriculum. And then there was discussion and they came to the conclusion maybe generationally for this group, the sort of Behold Thy Handmaiden communicates a subservience that they didn't want in the 1970s to communicate. So there was a new program. We've got one quote from a stake president in this period who said, look, we're happy to do whatever, and we support the general youth leadership, but please stop changing programs. And I think maybe some people after the past few years can relate to that sort of tension that they experienced after an era when one solution had worked as they're trying to find the new solution and reaching towards something that could be difficult for members to keep up with. Which I should say one more thing that happens in this period, though, is Elaine Cannon, as the general president of the Young Women Organization, does advocate for and succeed in securing Sunday instruction for young women. Before that, the MIA is primarily this separate organization and activity. As there's this greater focus on a spiritual core, she says we need a Sunday hour. And that becomes part of the new identity of the organization. Then in the next chapter, chapter 8, we spend a lot of time on the Ardith Cap presidency. and really try to slow down and give you a behind the scenes look of what it could mean to lead this organization, um, and how she and the women working with her sought revelation together, tried to navigate this new post-correlation church structure and figure out how to build consensus around something and come up with new ways of communicating with the church's young women. I think Arda's interesting because in some ways she's almost anticipating the media environment that we would have in the 21st century. Um, this first photo you see is of a worldwide balloon event where people wrote their testimonies down, put them in helium balloons, and let them go together. So it was something that was a global event, but also very locally experienced. And so even without those elaborate lines of communication uh, that they'd had in previous periods, she was able to sort of almost create meme-like experiences for people to have, where they could have through broadcasts and other things a shared experience that was also a local experience. Of course, she also gave us the Young Women's Values and the Personal Progress Program that really formed the core of the identity, what it meant to be a young woman in the church over the next 4 decades. So then when we proceed to the next chapter, we hit the moment where there are more church members outside of the United States than inside the United States. You see on the left, that's the first girls' camp in Mongolia, as they're trying to figure out what is this going to look like in our context. Uh, we talk about people in several different countries and different sort of family realities and how they're relating to the church, finding mentors among their young women leaders. We've also got a picture of the Elaine Dalton Young Women Presidency as they add one more value, the virtue value, as part of that continuing impulse that we see recurring to sort of defend certain values and the things that we're trying to teach young women to differentiate themselves from the culture and to prepare themselves for spiritual growth. Um, this chapter ends with the missionary age change. It's interesting when we go back to that heyday of the MIA, in chapter 5, the average marriage age in the United States broadly for women was about 20 years old. And so the Young Women program really was also operating as like a marriage prep. And some of you may remember iterations of Young Women where those themes were still very strong, left over from earlier periods. We feel like more recently, with the missionary age change and substantial demographic change in terms of people getting married later, um, that missionary service and church service have become more sort of the center of what the Young Women program is trying to prepare people for. And so in this last chapter, we describe a new reality where there's a lot of focus on how young women can serve as disciples of Christ now, how they can be actively involved, often in digital ways, in family history through initiatives like Just Serve, in service, and in building each other up. We have young women presidencies who really start thinking about what are the basic skills that the next generation is going to need to administer the church, and emphasizing building those sort of leadership fundamentals. And that takes us up to the present moment. So, in addition to giving you that lightning tour of the book, we wanted to feature just a few themes that are recurring through. The first theme that we found in this book is the feelings we have now, um, that that youth are dealing with a very different reality than what a lot of us grew up with, and that it may be difficult. Sometimes we wonder, what is it going to take to keep faith alive? How many people are going to hold on to this? Those questions are not new. Whether it's the beginning when the railroad came to Utah and the experience of walking across the plains was over and a new economy was coming into the space, and people worried whether it's the end of plural marriage, where a lot of mothers worried, are my daughters going to be able to get married at all? If they do get married, they're no longer gonna be able to see how religious their husbands are, how established they are in families. So there was concern, which is funny. Now we know that worked out very well. And we're happy with the change, but at the time they didn't know. That was alarming. We studied the 1918 pandemic and the sort of cultural shift in the 1920s. The 1960s would be another moment. Again and again, we see that young women is the place where older generations come and try to bring all the resources they have, and it becomes a meeting place with a younger generation. And I did love, we quote a former board member named Elsie Talmadge Brandley, who in the 1930s was thinking about media changes and films and the different ways people were talking about sexuality, and and sort of was confessional about the struggles of youth and her struggle to meet them where they were. They were asking questions she never would have dared ask, but at the same time said, I wonder how people of older generations who are sure they would make all the right decisions today, how would they react to these challenges? And what would they do? So we've got a long history of older generations respecting youth and rising to that crisis and developing sort of healthy listening and mentoring relationships. The next theme we wanted to discuss is the theme of female leadership. This book was an opportunity for us to really analyze how leaders studied things out in their mind and looked for solutions. We talked about that chapter with Ardith Kapp, and how she inherited a program that had been through a lot of changes and was still looking for its identity. And she really looked at all kinds of resources that were available to build a picture of what young women were going through, what innovations in the world, what new thought from different fields could be brought to bear on those problems. And then she calls it going to the mountain, right? Just really seeking inspiration, revelation, and finding it and giving a new identity. She said specifically, one lack she noticed for young women is that young men had scriptures to go to, and young women needed something to hold on to that worked for them in the same way and described their role the way that young men had scriptures about Aaronic priesthood, which is what gave us the young women theme, which many, many people still remember. And so that and other just wonderful examples of general and local female leadership in action.
Okay, I'm gonna go quickly here so that we can get to Matt's questions, because I know he'll facilitate a great discussion with us. Another theme we see in the book is that of retrenchment and engagement. So it's never absolute. There's always elements of both, but it exists on a spectrum. And at sometimes we are more inward facing. That's the retrenchment periods, where we're worried about fortifying ourselves, about turning away from the world, about protecting that program of defense idea. This is what the organization starts out with. And then we have periods where we're more outward looking and more engaged with the world. I'm going to skip that. One of the real interesting periods for this, as James was just talking about in the generational crisis theme, is around 1920, in the thick of this sense of cultural revolution in the wake of the Great War. It's the progressive era, and the Latter-day Saints actually take a very optimistic and outward-looking approach to mobilize the resources of the community to meet these challenges. There's a little bit of a freak out for a minute, about the new clothes and the new dances and all the things that are going on. But for the most part, they really marshal the community resources in a very optimistic way to the point there's a social advisory committee organized, and if we want to talk more about that, we can, but representatives from all of the organizations, and they go to New Orleans in 1920 for the National Conference of Social Work, where they actually see themselves as part of a larger, divinely inspired effort to solve society's problems. And they come back really impressed, feeling that these people, their co-workers in social work in the United States, are being inspired in what they're doing. And yet they come home and say, okay, well, we've learned some great things. We're going to put those to work here, but we believe that we have a more complete plan through the gospel that we can harness these ideas and use them. So there's a synergy there. Another theme that recurs throughout the book is that of spirituality. So when the organization, this first meeting with Brigham Young and his daughters, he is reported to have said that there is a need for the young daughters of Israel to get a living testimony of the truth. Now, he almost certainly did not say that on that night. Sousa puts it in her history of the YLMIA that's published in 1911. And at that point, it becomes this prophetic charge and a central defining imperative for the organization for decades to come. So spirituality remains this central focus in the organization, testimony. But what does that mean? It actually kind of means different things at different times. Not that there's not always a central core there of believing in God, believing in Christ, having your own personal witness. But we really see this if we compare the Beehive Girls material. This is 1915, with the later Young Women theme. And again, we don't present these contrasts by way of saying one is better or worse, but just by observing the differences. So the spirit of the hive, which is the Beehive Girls kind of theme, maybe the first theme in the Young Women organization, you can see here is about having faith, seeking knowledge, safeguarding health, and so forth. In the manual, it describes the program this way. The purpose is to train for service, to create love for life and work, a love for the world, and to discover all that is worthy in it. Can you feel the energy and the optimism and the outward-looking nature of this? To throw romance around ordinary duties, to show that activity is life, and to enrich activity, to teach girls to be orderly, to divide their time and use it successfully, to socialize their lives, in brief, to perfect their womanhood and help them hold to the faith of their fathers and to develop it in their individual womanhood. And then this is key, drawing from all good sources to do so. So this is a very expansive concept of spirituality as the whole person, as looking outward, as taking good from all the sources that we can. And then we compare this to 1985. And I don't think Art of Cap would have necessarily disagreed with those goals, but it is interesting to see the way that spiritual ideals are spoken about differently in different times. And so we have this 1985 Young Women theme, which I'm sure a number of us here could stand and recite, right? We are daughters of our Heavenly Father who loves us, and we love Him. We will stand as witnesses of God at all times and in all things and in all places as we strive to live the young women values, and so forth. So that's just a little bit of an overview of this theme in the book about what is spirituality and what does it look like at different times, and what do we gain and what do we lose when we articulate it in different ways. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and Matt, we would love to hear from you. Let's see, how do I, here we go. All right.
You are still sharing, Lisa.
Okay, let me figure out how to stop doing that. There we go. That's why I couldn't see. Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. As you say, right, that was a lovely overview that provides all these interesting themes and possibilities and routes that we can follow up on. And I hope we do in this question and answer period. So I do have a few questions for you, some things that occurred to me while you were talking, some things I'd like to follow up on. But I also want, of course, to invite those who are with us tonight to add their questions. You can put them in that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I see there's a couple already, and we will get to those shortly. So first I want to ask a bit about the production of this book before turning to some of the things you brought up in it. Can you tell us what the origins of this volume were, whose idea it was in the first place, what some of the aims of it were, and then how it was written? I know you've been working on it, you personally, Lisa, but also many of the rest of you for quite a while.
So there's a kind of a prehistory to the book, which was during Elaine Dalton's presidency. She convened a committee that included Brittany Chapman, now Brittany Chapman Nash, one of our colleagues at the time. And they began kind of exploring and doing a little bit of research towards better understanding the history of the Young Women organization. I don't know that there was a real specifically envisioned product or goal of that. So that kind of happens maybe around 2010, 2012, somewhere in there. In 2015, as Kate Holbrook and Jenny Reeder were finishing up work on At the Pulpit, the first 50 years of Relief Society was coming out. They were finishing At the Pulpit. We started looking around for like, what's the next thing? What should we do? And so Jenny, Kate, Brittany, and I started discussing our desire to do a history of the Young Women organization. And that was rooted in a recognition that, number one, it had never been done before. And there was a lot that we just did not know. And then those conversations that Brittany had been part of, and then in my own work, my dissertation was on young women in the 1890s. And I had done, more work in generational theory and trying to understand that. So I was all for just building on that. And so I actually started doing preliminary work and research on the book in 2015. So it's been 10 years in the making, this book has. We were able to put a proposal together and get it approved in 2016. And then there were permutations on the team and different things that happened, but it mostly was me and Kate working on it for a few years. And then in 2019, we brought Amber on board, and we had already had James start working with us in a consulting role to help us kind of figure out how to structure the book and what the narrative was and how to put it all together. And then he came on board in 2020 as a full co-author on the project. The thing about it is, as I say, it hadn't ever been done before. And so we're sitting on the gold mine of sources about the history of the Young Women organization, but it was all spade work to figure this out in even the most basic way. What is the story? And early on, this cultural, institutional framework we started working with. And we recognized that due to limitations in our source base, which maybe James can talk a little bit more about, that we couldn't do everything. And so we decided that it was going to make the biggest contribution if we could simply lay out that institutional narrative of how this organization developed over time. And then that would hopefully provide seeds and openings for people who read the book and who are interested to build on and make room for more research.
Yeah, I would say it's really nice that we got to work collaboratively while you're trying to juggle these different research threads, that the spine of the book is this, what happened with the organization? And we've got one set of research that's like looking at leadership minutes and looking at even local documents, but trying to figure out what's supposed to be going on. Then we've got another thread, which is what are they responding to, and not necessarily saying they're responding to what's happening in the culture. Um, that's informing, right? Always minutes are kind of half of a conversation. They're responding to something, they're bringing it to it, but they're immersed in it, and the fish don't tell you about the water. So we were doing that kind of research. And then for every chapter, we really wanted to do something as much as we could to give life to it. One of the closing quotes of the book is that the history of this organization, or the treasure of this organization, is the lives of the young women who experienced it, who went through it. And so it's a separate kind of research to find these ephemeral sources, like old treasures of truth books. Which ones survived from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and what do they tell us about the young women who were gathering stories and writing down their thoughts? Later we were able to interview people about their experiences in young women and how that affected them. And then, of course, the early periods, it's difficult archival research to find what did it look like in Cedar City when somebody showed up and said, "Hey, we're doing a new thing. We called you as president." So as you read the book, you'll get institutional story, cultural story, and then this color of what was it like to live this? And the team was constantly working to bring those three together and help them work in harmony.
And I'll just say, we had a pretty complete draft of the book by 2021, 22, the year that we lost Kate. We were still doing some revising, and it had to go through all the reviews and approval process. And I don't know, it just took a long time. But what happened is that the young women presidency changed, and Emily Bell Freeman was put in, I think, in April of 2023, right at the point where we had a complete, almost final manuscript that we were able to share with her. And she was so excited. She had a real impression to understand the history of the organization. And there was the manuscript. And we had not quite figured out how to end the book, because like by the time you get up to 2020, we're doing journalism, we're just really talking about what's been going on in the present and recently. And we were able to have some conversations and some interviews with her while she was still in the early phases of thinking through her leadership and what she wanted to have happen, in a way that really helped us bring the book full circle and helped us to figure out how to complete the book. So there was something, at the very least, providential in the timing and the way that this worked out.
Wonderful. We got some really wonderful questions in the Q&A, but I do want to ask you one more, and then I will turn to those. And that is, at least in my generation, watching my sister in the women's organization and so on, I think one of the most memorable things about it was these names. Beehives, gleaners, Maya maids, all of these kinds of terms. And I wonder if you might just say a little bit about the evolving titles of a young woman in the church and what the evolution of those titles tells us about the focus of the program.
Yeah, we could both speak to this, and we need to try to make these answers a little shorter so we have time to get to more questions. But what I can say is, if you read the book, you will know where all those names came from. And most of them originate in the 1920s and 30s, some into the 1950s, but by the 50s, they're building on this established tradition. And it's this era of just this real love of symbolism. And it's so fascinating to see how much they just loved symbolism. And so they felt that there was something instructive and even spiritual about these names that would help young women to have this experience in the program that would help build them up. And the constant in the history of the organization is change. So we do, one of the charts that we have in those online appendices is a chart that shows the classes and age groups over time. And what you will see is that it changes frequently. It changes a lot because they're always trying to figure out what, they're always seeing some new need or something that they're trying to address through that. So by 1959, you have beehive. It's 2 words. They never call the girls beehives. I'm just going to be pedantic about that. It's the beehive class, the Maya maid, and the Laurel class is introduced in 1959. And so those names then last for another, 60 years? So it's that mid 20th century period where they implement a lot of these things, and then that builds a framework that lasts.
And if you read the book, you'll get to see a few glimpses into what they didn't name the classes. We could have had Zionas or Zionas. I don't know how they pronounced it instead of Laurels.
Yes.
So yeah, like Gleaner goes back to the story of Ruth. It's got these deep images. There definitely was a lot of stuff. As possibilities planning, you can see the challenge of finding kind of the right image to distill to.
And Ruth May Fox was like a one-woman symbolism machine because she was really integral in developing Beehive, and then she's really integral in Gleaners. She writes Carry On. She just really had a gift for all of that kind of stuff. And then I can't remember if this is still in the book or not, but in the 80s, Ardith Kapp considered some different names for the classes, one of which was Daughters of God. And that sounded great until somebody pointed out that the acronym would be DOG. So, some worked better than others.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to turn now to some of the questions in the Q&A box. There's some really excellent ones here. The first one that I think is really interesting is about correlation between the development of the organization and young women serving missions. And I think more broadly, how the teachings and the programs of the young woman shape how these young women become women, right? And what they see their role in the church is as adults.
Yeah, I think this is a great question that gets at the heart of that. We're talking a lot about aspirations and what the organization would like, and then you get these glimpses of how does it work out. I got to interview a woman named Linda McKayen is her maiden name, so that's what she is in the book. McCall is her married name now. She's biracial in Britain in the 1960s, joining the church, and really felt like she found family in the church. She found this support network. She said about her young women's leader at the time, she was my port of call. Whenever I had a crisis, I went to her. And then she further reports later she's out of the program, she's grown up, she's gotten established in a way that she hadn't totally visualized initially growing up, and is sort of the head nurse at a hospital managing a larger group, and still always finds herself thinking, what would my young women leaders do in this situation? How would they solve a problem? And that becomes like her mental model. And so yeah, mission is one recurring site, but I think it's nice that that question's broader. And definitely we do see evidence that leaders are invested not just in here's what we want you to do, but we want to help you be able to make decisions and coordinate service and all these kinds of skills. And then young women have different experiences, and it varies generation to generation, and then often do have following through on those things they did before. One more anecdote to that: we found someone in the 1920s or 30s who won the speech contest, the churchwide speech contest through the MIA, and I thought
It was actually 1913.
1913 for her. I thought, where do I know that name? She's in the church video, The Mailbox, late in her life. She's the old woman there, and here she was as a young woman building some of those things that were a continued part of her service. So, okay.
Yeah, and as far as missions specifically go, it is interesting. And I think we do mention in our chapter 2 about the new young woman expanding horizons for women. We do mention the first single young women to be called as missionaries. And then it wasn't a thread that we traced a lot through the 20th century, partly because they weren't really talking about it that much. You know, I think we all know that for a long time, serving a mission for women was just seen as like what you did if you didn't get married. And there were some ways in the MIA, like in the 50s, where serving a mission could help you earn your Golden Gleaner Award or that kind of thing. And so what it really speaks to is the changing life patterns for young women. And we already kind of talked about that a little bit, that by 2012, when the missionary age is changed and taken down to 19, I think it's an acknowledgement, a recognition that young women's life patterns have changed a lot, and that this opportunity is now something that can benefit them and the church. And there is much more of a demand, if you will. There's much more of a desire on the part of young women to serve missions. Now, up until 1972, the Young Women Organization has stewardship over women well into their 20s. And so well past or into mission age. After that, it's disentangled and 18 becomes the upper end. And so that's one reason in the later 20th century, I think that missions are not talked about as much, is because girls who leave young women at 18 still are at least 3 years away from being old enough to serve missions. But then with 2012, that brings the two back together again in a more urgent way.
Oh yeah, James, are you going to say something else? Okay. And that does bear on, I think, an interesting path where we might go next, and that is a questioner is interested in the relationship between the Young Women's Organization and the Young Men's Organization. The questioner particularly brings up the Boy Scouts, right? How the Boy Scouts provide a sort of ready-made young men's program for the church. But I wonder if you might comment to what extent you see these two organizations moving together, moving in different directions, what kinds of collaborations there might be, and what the impact of the Scouts is on the young woman.
Wow. Great question. We could spend quite a bit of time on this. The young ladies are organized in 1870. The young men are organized in 1875. And almost as soon as the young men are organized, the questions start arising. Should they be meeting together? What is the relationship between the two? Brigham Young is reported to have said, if the young men and young women meet together, they will just become courting meetings. The girls will go to be taken home, the boys will go to take them, and I will have nothing to do with either of them. And so there's this tension at the beginning. And as I mentioned, the Young Women's Organization originally is seen as part of the umbrella of the women's organizations in the church. It's kind of the daughter of the Relief Society. But then what happens around the turn of the century, in 1896, the young men come to the Young Ladies Organization and say, hey, let's have a conference together. And so they start having this, what becomes June Conference. And it inaugurates what we call in the book the conjoint movement, where the two organizations begin working together more closely. And it's not a coincidence that this is happening at the same time that the concept of adolescence is being articulated, which again is recognizing changing life patterns for young people. And so by 1910, you have one of the MIA leaders saying, well, I regard it as one organization with two branches, the young men and the young ladies, but it's all the MIA. And so what has happened is then the young part of Young Ladies has eclipsed the ladies part. So instead of a daughter of the Relief Society, it's now a sister to the young men, and the youth part becomes the animating imperative for the organization for both of them. And then through that 20th century period, starting really at the turn of the century and all the way up to the 1970s, the two organizations are the MIA, and they work very closely together. Now, again, there's so much more we could say about this, but to the question of Scouts particularly, as they start looking around and taking ideas from this progressive recreation movement and the progressive era, Boy Scouts becomes very attractive to the young men. And as early as 1910 or 1911, they're starting to have conversations, and there's like local groups forming on their own initiative and so forth. And so there's a lot of interest in the Boy Scouts. And after some kind of flirtations and discussions back and forth, the young men decide to affiliate with the Boy Scouts. I think that happens in 1913. And at first, they believe that they have successfully managed to do this on their own terms. So we're going to affiliate with the Boy Scouts, but we're going to kind of make it our own and so forth. But then that sets them on this trajectory of belonging to this national organization. At the same time, the young ladies' leadership starts looking at national girls' organizations. So Girl Scouts, and especially Campfire Girls. And these are big, popular, organizations taking off in this progressive era for girls. And they really like the Campfire Girls program. And they have one or two stakes that kind of pilot the Campfire Girls program, try it out. They really like it. But the young ladies' leadership are concerned about two things. They're concerned about the costs. They said membership in one of these national organizations is going to represent a tax on our members, and our leaders are going to become tax collectors for this national organization. And then the other thing is loss of autonomy. They did not want to just have to follow someone else's program. So it's out of that the Beehive Girls program is conceived, where they take a lot of elements from the Campfire Girls and they do it with the blessing of Luther and Charlotte Gulick, who are the leaders, the founders of the Campfire Girls. But they take that program, and then through inspiration, they find this book about the life of the bee, and they see, oh, this is our framework. And that then sets them off on the trajectory of the Beehive Girls program. So you can see with Scouts and with young women, you can kind of see two different trajectories. And we could talk about how and whether the Boy Scout affiliation over time became a tax on the members and, meant following somebody else's program. And it's not that simple. It's always complicated, but the young ladies did their own thing. And now we're kind of full circle with that now. But throughout all the permutations of the organizations, no matter how closely they're working together, the Scouts is always a fundamental framework for the young men. And in that era, in the 1970s, when everything's changing and there's a lot of turmoil, they have that to fall back on, and the young women don't. And so that becomes a real source of disparity in the programs for quite some time.
I just want to add one thing, and that is if you go to the Church Historians Press website and the pages for the book, you can look at images of the old Beehive Girl uniforms and bandalos.
Bands.
And awards, bands.
They're only ever called bands.
They're only ever called bands. But they have these award things that are in sort of honeycomb shape. And so it's a really interesting, they could evolve over time. And so that's further back in memory because they started to feel like we're still doing the spirit of this, but the configuration's going to be different. But people who remember sort of late 20th century scouting well, or early 21st century scouting, I think it's interesting to look at early 20th century beehive material culture And you can look at the requirement books as well. We've got those in the church catalog. They're buried a little deeper, but really interesting stuff to take a look at.
And those were called merit badges at first on the beehive bands. Yeah. I know that colloquially they were called band lows, but here I'm a little pedantic again. Officially, they were only ever called the band.
But very scouting reminiscent, it
Very,
seems like. Yeah.
very much.
Especially at first.
Mhm.
Especially at first. Yeah.
Let me turn to another question, and this is something you touched on, but I think we'd all really love to hear a bit more about it. How did the Young Women's Program adapt to international cultures? You gave a couple of examples of this, but the questioner particularly is interested in dating and courtship, and certainly there is in the mid 20th century a fair amount of curriculum being produced targeted at these concepts that have a very U.S. centric model for how dating and courtship should work. How has the Young Women's Organization grappled with that?
Yeah,
Right,
so
James.
two parts of adaptation just in general, and then I'll try to approach the courtship question more specifically. But yeah, in general, I mean, one of the early models is that there's a lot of local autonomy and everybody's doing a little bit their own thing. As it centralizes and is producing more, the advantage is that it's easier to scale this organization. Not everybody has to create things. A disadvantage is that sometimes it doesn't translate well. Speaking of translation, in the 1920s, when they start translating materials for the first time, they do not match one to one. So my mission was in Germany. One of my research tests was to look at the first German translation of young women's stuff, and it was interesting. In the English, it says a young woman should know some basic things about her body and how her body functions, period, right? 1920s US, that's what you say. The German one goes on for a while, right? They like brought in a Swiss doctor to give all this detail because culturally that was more appropriate there than here, right? And so sometimes you see that adaptation happening in this sort of individual ad hoc that's probably happening at the level of the European mission. And the wife of the mission president is working with other female leaders, organizational leaders in Europe, and they're making some decisions about how to make things match. You definitely do have, when you jump forward to like the Ardith Cap era, and here's our new program, and we've got these more abstract values. Some of those translate, some don't in different places. And then you also have personal progress requirements. I think that's when we start to see more overt grappling. I guess another thing I should say is in the 1960s moment, when they're doing MIA and the missions, their metaphor is an accordion, that we're going to create this program so you can make it larger or smaller depending on where you are. But that doesn't necessarily communicate fundamentally different, right? More or less is one way to adapt, but that's not all the kind of adaptations we were just asked about. Once they're in that late 20th century period, producing stuff, sending it out, they start to realize some of the personal progress requirements we've made are culturally situated. They don't make sense in different cultures. And so there will be these revisions where they try to say, well, you could do this or this, maybe this. You also see things like there was a journaling requirement. And one thing they realized very early is not everybody has access to paper. And they actually redesign the booklet so there's blank pages in it. So if you're in a place where like access to paper isn't consistent, there's at least something, right? So it's interesting to see leaders kind of bridge that. Um, yeah, courtship specifically. Can you help me, Lisa, on this one? I mean, there's such
Yeah.
ambivalence in general. You'd heard even from Brigham Young, no, we don't want it. Yes, we do. In some places, that's like a a really important purpose when you have low populations of Latter-day Saints is, oh, can young people meet each other, especially in the eras where they're also doing people in their 20s together? Golden Green Ball, can that be the place for people to meet? But yeah, then you have other contexts where we're not dating at all, and so not all the lesson materials are working. And I think that may be one factor among others that influences this shift away from the sort of 1950s shaped marriage preparation curriculum towards discipleship oriented, because following Jesus Christ translates much better, right? You can serve in any culture. You can coordinate in any culture. You can find standards and live them and make sacrifices for your testimony in any culture in a way that the exact relationship dynamics or timing of how to pursue relationships is very culturally dependent.
Yeah, and we didn't trace that thread specifically. I know from my work on saints, actually, that, there were cultures where couples dancing was just like a no comprende. That just wasn't the way that things worked. So, but the way that the MIA is structured, particularly in that 50s, 60s era, is that the older groups of young men and young women, so the gleaners and the M men, the junior gleaners and the junior M men, the ensigns and laurels, they are meeting together pretty much every week. Their lesson manual is joint. So to the extent that that is being exported, the structure of the organization is creating conditions and overtly teaching courtship, marriage, and that kind of thing. And then it's really when the older groups get split off in 72, so that the young men and young women is really a youth organization up to 18. That's a little different. Now, those of us who grew up in the young women organization in the 70s, 80s, and 90s can attest that at least culturally, there was still a great deal of influence, of emphasis on marriage for women. And that takes on a certain tenor in the face of ERA, feminism, women's lib, all of the cultural wars that start to take off in the 70s and 80s. And so many of us, we could sit here and have a testimony meeting about some of the trauma that some of us have about the things that we were taught, and some of that was in the lesson materials, and some of it was just culturally determined. But there's no question that looking towards marriage traditionally was a very important part of what young women were being taught in the organization, both formally and informally.
Good. Let me back up a little bit as we are coming to a close and ask some bigger picture questions about the book generally. One of our attendees makes an interesting comparison to Daughters of My Kingdom, right? Which, of course, is the history of the Relief Society produced, boy, how long ago? 15 years ago now? Something like
Yeah.
that.
Yep.
Yeah, time flies, huh? And and the kind of inconsistency with which that was used throughout the church, right? Sometimes applied and used in Relief Society, sometimes not. Um, is there any sort of expectation or hope for use of this book? Is there anything you've heard in your interactions with President Freeman and her counselors as to how this book might be applied?
Yeah. I was in a Relief Society presidency when Daughters in My Kingdom came out. And the official guidance was, this is not a lesson manual. You don't use this for lessons. And it just left us all going, what, okay, what is this? But that was a completely different project than what this is, because it was written as a devotional overview text for the women of the church. This book does not pretend to be anything other than what it is, which is a fairly academic treatment of the history of the organization. We tried very hard to write it in an accessible and engaging way. James was a big reason we succeeded at that, if we did. But it was not written to be a curriculum material. It was not written to be a devotional text that would be used in the church. Now, that having been said, we've already seen, and we feel that one of the most important contributions of this book is internal education for church leaders to have an awareness of this history that has not been known before, and especially, but not only for the Young Women organization. That is a very important function of the book. It will go online full text in 18 months once Deseret Book has sold as many books as they can. And at that time, we are in discussions. We believe it will end up in the Gospel Library app alongside First 50 Years and At the Pulpit and so forth. And so by making it available, then that, for those who are interested, will hopefully translate into some usage and awareness. But James actually can speak to this as well. We are working on how to take this material and repackage it for church use.
Yeah. Let me say first that in terms of Relief Society, the more direct corollary for what we did in this book is Women of Covenant,
right,
rather than Daughters in My Kingdom. And
right.
And if you haven't taken a look at that book, that's a wonderful book, right? That gives us this more detailed picture of where has the organization been and how has it wrestled with things and what's the context. So carry on is going to be important to help us understand ourselves, but it's not for everyone, right? It's for the people who want that more detailed understanding and who are going to seek inspiration by studying, by study and by faith. This gives you some material for study because the questions we deal with are recurring questions. We've seen that, what is it? History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Um, some of the questions we're wrestling with now rhyme with the kind of things we've been through before. So we hope that people who do read, who've got the bandwidth in their lives to really digest something, can suck the marrow from this book and get a lot of insight out of this book. Frankly, the way I think a lot of church members will end up getting messages from this book is probably in channels like social media, where we'll prepare things that take core ideas but communicate them in 90 seconds or something. If you look on the Relief Society Worldwide Instagram account, there's a couple of church history pieces there about Relief Society history that have been told in ways that benefit from this full complexity and a sophisticated historical understanding, but are communicated much more accessibly in 90 seconds in simple terms that give people new ways to approach Relief Society today in light of that history. And that's part of the answer, I would say, to how is the core of this book used devotionally, is that we continue to tell these stories, whether it's you digesting this and retelling stories and quoting women in your lessons, or whether it's the church institutionally repackaging things in ways that young women are more likely to consume.
Excellent, thank you. You've been talking, I have put a few things in the chat for people to look at. There's a link there to Woman in Covenant, which is I think, quite scholarly history of the Relief Society that James references. I also link to a website on the church's website that has digital copies of Treasures of Truth, which one of our questioners has asked to see. So you can see digital copies there. We are, I think, wrapping up here. And I wonder if the two of you might back up and speak a little bit more broadly to how the history of the Young Women's Organization and your work on this book has marked or shaped how the two of you understand what it is to be a member of the church. How has this project shaped your own spiritual lives and devotional lives? How has it helped you understand more fully what the church is about?
You want me to go first? Yeah. um, I mean, looking through when we talked about generational crisis and generational mentoring, right? When you look back in the history, it becomes very clear that we never know exactly what the next generation is going to go through. We never completely understand what they are going through. And religion is, it exists by being recreated in every generation, right? They have to take in the core and find a way to live it in their world that makes sense. And so, I don't know, I think it built my confidence in a weird way to be able to see that process happening again and again. That every time the torch gets passed, it's uncertain, it's difficult, nobody's quite sure this how things are going to turn up. And every time when you study the young women and see them light up and see the way that this material they're handed, there's always something that does seem to be connecting them with God and solving problems in their life and driving them forward. That's really encouraging, right? Um, and so I think maybe Daniel's image of the stone cut without hands rolling, right? We are not the cutters. We're just part of this process as it bumps and rolls along. But but in a way, the institutional story almost takes some focus off the institution because you see the way that institutions are reactions to this theological spirit that's coming through as it interacts with outside cultural forces, and we build institutions and traditions at a meeting point, right? Generations connect with each other at a meeting point, but there's sort of that core spiritual interaction happening. And so I think I'm a little more willing to just let the rock roll, and enjoy the youth in my ward and see how they embrace things and offer what I can offer, but trust them to find the way for it all to connect.
Thanks for that, James. Lisa, any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know how much I can add to that. It's caused me to think a lot about history. And history is useful to think with. I find history to be useful as a resource, but not necessarily something that we should be trying to replicate or duplicate every time. But history has resources for us in thinking about things. So, and then also, like, as we go through time and things change, the metaphor I use is like, what's the baby and what's the bathwater? And how often do we think we're throwing out bathwater and we end up losing some babies along the way? And if we know the history, then we can go back and find those babies. You know, sometimes there are things that for one reason or another didn't seem necessary or workable at a certain time, that when we go back and look at it now, we think, wow, actually that there's some real potential there. One of the places that I see that in the history, and this is just me speaking, but in this idea of teaching the gospel through activities and the more expansive vision of what we're trying to do with youth, I find that very inspiring. And by giving them really meaningful things to do from week to week and be part of something bigger. And that is something that I think was one of the babies that got thrown out in that correlation era, in that era of simplification. And it's understandable why it happened. I don't say that with any sense of judgment or recrimination, but it was interesting to see in the oral histories from many of the leaders who spanned those eras, who had been in the old MIA and then gone through that transitional period. In the 80s, around 1980, early 1980s, we have several oral histories from both male and female leaders of those eras, and almost to a person, they say, yeah, we just really didn't intend for those cultural activities to get so lost. It was kind of an unintended consequence when they were focusing on so many other things. Understandable again, but also something that they lamented even then, and that maybe to a certain extent, we haven't ever quite figured out how to reclaim that, that broader vision of youth programs. I hope we're at a moment where some of those babies are being rescued from where they fell. And obviously it can't ever look the same. We can't have 14,000 young people dancing on the field of the Rice-Eccles Stadium and have that be the representation of youth in the church like it was in the 1950s. But there are a lot of ways that we can think about how to help young people see themselves as part of something bigger. And that is, I think, a really powerful part of what the youth programs did for kids for a long time. My dad danced in that dance festival in 1958. And to the day he died, that was one of the highlights of his life that he would talk about. And I'm in the church because there was an MIA program in his ward where someone put their arm around him and said, hey, David, come to Scouts. Have you thought about playing basketball? Come and dance in the dance festival. Have you thought about going on a mission? Could we buy you a suit? I'm in the church because of that. And I think there are a lot of really powerful ways we could think about how to adapt and revive some of those experiences and those, it's almost an ethic for our young people today.
That's a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing it. And I think both of you have helped us see, right, that in a lot of ways, the story of the Young Women's Association of the Church as a whole, that is a story of change and evolution and movement through a shifting landscape with perhaps a constant goal that we're always striving towards but never quite reach. This has been, I think, a wonderful evening, and to thank both of you for joining us here. We are going to invite back now the Gills to offer us a closing prayer. And before that happens, I want to remind all of you, you can find in the chat now a link to the place where this video will be posted. You will see in that link our past events and there where you can join our mailing list for the Mormon Studies program here at CGU. You'll get announcements for everything that we are doing. So thank you all for coming tonight, metaphorically and digitally. We are happy to see you with us. And I will now give it to Sunitha to give a closing prayer.
Dear Heavenly Father, we are so grateful to Thee for this opportunity to be here and to learn more about the Young Women's Organization. We're grateful for the authors of the book that have put in so much effort to learn more about the evolution of the program and the Lord's hand in watching over His children. We know that Thou lovest us, and we are grateful for our youth and for their diligence and faith. And we ask Thee to bless them in this era, that they may continue to stay strong and that we may find ways to support them in their effort to stay active and strong in the gospel. We ask thee to bless the authors for all of their effort, and we ask these blessings in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you again, Lisa and James, and thank you all. Have a good night.